cosmetic governance, and that needs to recognise then that But what we can say unquestionably and unambiguously is that poor governance shreds value. So even if we were a little unconvinced about the benefits of good governance, we can certainly see in its absence the potential for it to harm and hinder and destroy the interests of the organisation and those to whom they owe a duty. There are, of course, many, many recent examples across financial services with the Hayne Royal Commission, aged care, Royal Commission equally, with a very large focus of both inquiries into governance. The gaming industry, both Star and Crown, and more recently, a high-profile professional services example as well with one of the big four. And I asked the question rhetorically, is the not-for-profit sector any different? Well, of course it's not. It has its own challenges. I've pointed to aged care as a for instance, but the Royal Commission into Institutional Abuse of Children also saw many, many organisations not provide, not solely because of governance, but the limitations of their governance meant there was a limited ability to, or discharge of those duties and responsibilities. And so while our focus is, of course, on not-for-profit today, these are duties shared right across all our organisations. But where it can get challenging, and we'll come to this in a bit more detail, is the practical application of that in across entities of very different type. So what are some of those challenges? Fundamentally, the single greatest challenge is where the organisation has preferred the interests of those to whom they owe a duty over some other priority. And so when you look at some of those examples before, be it banking, aged care, institutions, religion, religious institutions and others, including my own organisation, it's the failure to prioritise and discharge and meet the obligations of those to whom they owe an interest. And so in the recent example with PwC, the CEO recently said, we've prioritised profit over purpose. In the Bell inquiry into Star, there was numerous witnesses gave evidence that the pursuit of revenue and profit was paramount to everything else. And all these organisations had all the artefacts, they had all the policies and the frameworks, the codes of conduct. So I say it's necessary but not sufficient. That's cosmetic governance. Good governance is reflected in behaviour and standards and culture and leadership. But we know it's challenging, it's easy to say, but all of these examples aren't full of bad people. And this is where the ethical dimension comes in. good people are otherwise making poor choices. And why is that? Well, there are many reasons, but incentive certainly has a role to play here, and not necessarily just financial incentives, but certainly that's an element. There's a great article, I've got an image of it on the slide here. If you haven't come across it, it's an old school management article called "The Folly of Rewarding A While Hoping for B." And it's got some great examples of where organisations with good intent create incentives that promote undesirable outcomes. We see it in safety, we see it in STAR, sorry, trying to find the right description, but with their treatment, of there was nearly, I think, $900 million in gaming expenses that were treated as, or categorised as hotel expenses, so that they didn't need to be reported. Now, that's not solely attributable to incentives, but one of the witnesses, one of whom I know and I would otherwise consider to be a person of integrity, spoke about this, the surrounding expectation of the senior team to treat certain things in a certain way. So no one said go and directly and expressly go and do the wrong thing, but the environment fostered that. And so for our own organisations, we're thinking about and reflecting on our own environments and culture. Are there things that we need to be alert to? What would be the flags if our environment wasn't promoting the behaviours and the conduct that support good governance? Information, the quality, the quantity, access to it is often an issue when we're talking about governance. When we're talking with boards and senior teams, there's often this discussion about too much, not enough, not good enough. If you go and talk with, if this were a room of directors, some of you may be directors, a common complaint is management never give us what we want. And then when you talk with the executives, they say, board never tell us what they need. Have the conversation. Are your boards, are your executives teams providing and sharing the right kind of information, the quality of information as well as the quantity of information? Now, there were some examples through these inquiries of enormous volumes of information being provided to boards. So it's not simply more is better, but the quality of the information that's being provided so that those who have a responsibility for good governance can meet those duties. And those with those duties have to ask the right questions. As obvious and self-evident as that sounds, too many of these inquiries have shown that people with the responsibility to ask the hard questions haven't done so. Now, these are otherwise people that are competent, experienced people, but it's the environment in which the absence of challenge doesn't promote the right kind of understanding and questions. But the other practical challenge here is boards, of course, and I think this is one of the difficulties for non-executive directors, is of course all the information or nearly all the information for directors comes through management. Now, that's not to say there's anything proper, that's entirely appropriate. But it does mean, and I'm sure you've seen instances of this, that there's always there's a filtering, there's a sanitisation process that goes on. As I say, I'm not suggesting there's anything improper. This is a natural part of the process, but it does mean that nearly everything that's going to the board is subject to those filters. So as a director charged with good governance, you need to be able to look through and ask the right kind of questions to make sure you're getting the right kind of information. The other common challenge is, and one of the inquiries into CBA, and it's not about CBA because it's not the only place, but as an illustration, they spoke about the voice of risk not being heard. And the reason for that is in part, and these are organisations that are successful at the time. So these aren't organised, and this was one of the cultural challenges, is that those who said, is this right? That voice was not heard as strongly because all the formal and the financial indicators would say we're healthy, we're performing, we're doing well. And NFP will have their own metrics. Government agencies will have their own metrics as to what performance, good performance looks like. But that voice, I worked with one government agency where they did a 5-year review of the internal audit plan, the internal audit program, an outcome of which was there'd been no material findings at all in the 5 years of reviews, to which everyone was congratulating themselves. Now, my view was, if you've got an internal audit program that hasn't uncovered anything material in 5 years, then either the organisation is perfect or it's not looking in the right places. No organisation will have is perfect. Public, private, large, listed. What was happening in this case was the internal audit function was being pushed in the direction that management wanted to go. Go and look at this long list of things that we don't really care about and certainly weren't strategic. Now, again, this wasn't a case where there were people acting with ill intent. This is a case where the internal audit function wasn't seen to provide value and was largely seen as a compliance activity. And so management kind of steered it away into areas that where it wouldn't be a nuisance. So that voice of risk and assurance is an important one, but it's got to have the mandate and the competency to deliver on it. Conflicts of interest, and I'll come back to this because this is an area of common, an area in which issues commonly arise. But being able to identify them and handle them is an important one. Now, the PwC situation, again, it's not about PwC per se, but it's an illustration of issues that bubble up in many other organisations. They're a professional entity. I'm sure, I don't know whether they're CPA or CA, but many would be members, all professional, trained, competent people of integrity. So this isn't a question of understanding what a conflict looks like, but the awareness of the handling and what to do about it, should it arise. Now, I think it's fair to say that there'll be criticism of some for going further than that. But others, the criticism may well be they either didn't recognise it as an issue, potential problem, or weren't prepared or comfortable to say anything about it. So the answer to this is Kerry's opinion. I don't think more training is the answer here. More training on what is a conflict of interest. I think it's more difficult than that because it's the cultural challenge of speaking up, of understanding what an ethical dilemma might look like, and then what could you do about it? Because this isn't simply a question of what's legal and what's ethical. The CEO of Star and is on the public record is in one case saying, in regard to the way they were treating certain financial aspects of the business, said it wasn't illegal. There was no law saying we couldn't do it. In another instance, said everyone else was doing it. So the law, as important as it is, won't always give us the answer. It'll tell us, can we? But there's still the question of should we? And good governance should always be thinking about not simply can we, but the should we. In making that, can't quite see it there, but at the bottom there, there's 3 steps for dealing with ethical dilemmas, which can be challenging. There's a simple process. One of the best definitions I saw, a three-step process I've come across, and there are many, is simply this. Is it legal? Is it right? What if we're in the news? Now, I find that pretty handy. I think if you when faced with an ethical challenge, if you're to ask yourself, is it legal? Is it right? What if in the news? If you're comfortable, that will point you to the right course of action. I think at any time through that, if there's something that gives you cause to pause, then that should point you to the right decision. But certainly when we talk about good governance, there are some practical challenges in discharging it, regardless of your sector or size. Now, I've mentioned conflicts of interest, and I'd like to just come back to that because they are a common source of trouble. Now, an interest, of course, can be a wide range of things, financial or non-financial, maybe actual, potential, or perceived. And we often talk about conflicts when in fact, all we're really talking about are the interests. The conflict doesn't arise until such time as that interest potentially conflicts with a duty owed to your organisation. Now, you'll see there that there's lots of examples of what might give rise to a potential conflict. But the challenge isn't so much identifying them, but dealing with them. And it's in the grey where we find this to be a bit tricky. When it's black or white, legal, illegal, it's easy, or it should be easy. Now, for some, you'll find guidance in I've got a reference here to Governance Institute Code, but of course CPA and other, you'll find sources for how to deal with conflicts of interest in many places. But they'll all provide guidance around how to handle them, which fundamentally can be brought down to what I'd call the sunlight test. You've got to declare them, and not simply declare them, but deal with them. And each organisation will have different processes for how to do that. But as I said, it's relatively easy when it's black and white, or legal or illegal. A colleague of mine, former colleague of mine, is now in a senior role with the ICAC, the Independent Commission Against Corruption, says if you can reduce the grey, you reduce the risk. So if there's no coffee, if there's no lunch, if there's no bottles of wine, then the risk of a potential conflict is minimised. But not everyone agrees with that. I know I've spoken with executives in many organisations who say there is a proper place for entertainment, for relationship building, whether you're for purpose or for profit. There is a place for that. So I'm not saying that these are universal truths, but it is important that you understand how they apply and should apply in your own organisations, so that it's clear what those expectations are, and so that they can be navigated if a problem should arise. One of the reasons many years ago now, but I think police used to enjoy, I think it was a discount at McDonald's or free something or other at Macca's. And one of the reasons why they got rid of that was on its own doesn't appear harmful, but it starts to create expectations potentially and creates grey. And that's where we're looking to try and understand for your own organisation what that might look like. And if there's room for gifts, benefits, entertainment, and so on, being very clear around what the rules are. All right, now for any organisation, including not-for-profits, funding, of course, is the lifeblood of the organisation. For NFPs, there's some of the sources noted here. There are, of course, others, but governance plays a very important role in safeguarding those things through integrity, through assurance, through oversight. Not only those things, but they're important ingredients in ensuring that the receipt, use, acquittal of those funds is done appropriately and in the best interest of the organisation. Now, again, you'll find many sources of guidance or standards. The if you're not familiar with the AICD's governance principles, it's an excellent source for not-for-profits. It includes some commentary around funding in particular. But as I said at the start, thematically it reflects the many standards you'll find elsewhere, be that in New South Wales Treasury policies or ASX governance principles. Fundamentally, they're around ensuring that the duties that the organisation works to meet the interests and creates duties of interest to meet the interests of those to whom the organisation owes a duty. So if you're not aware of those, they're publicly available and a very good source. Now, we're talking about governance and assurance and oversight, integrity. The Audit Committee has an important role to play. That's not the only, it's not solely the domain of the Audit Committee, but it certainly is a key, has a key function. Now, I was interested recently in a white paper from the Institute of Internal Audit, which included this statement. It is true that effort and contribution will often come down to the remuneration offered. Any thoughts on that statement for those that are in public sector or not-for-profit, where you may have volunteer directors or audit committee members, or those on relatively lower remuneration compared to private sector? Thank you. We just need to use them. Yep, just.
We have directors that are not remunerated. So I would be contrary to that comment there. We have quite a calibre and experience with our directors, but perhaps whilst it's not the remuneration that's offered, it might be the brand of the not-for-profit that might be the feature that attracts that calibre of director.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Nisha. Any more comments or anything from anyone in the room? No?
But I'd agree. I think certainly in my experience, I don't think that is an accurate reflection of the calibre and competency of many directors in not-for-profit nor indeed public sector. And indeed, what we saw through a number of those inquiries that we mentioned earlier is that some very highly remunerated directors were found to be asleep at the wheel. So I'm not sure that REM is a reliable indicator as to whether or not the effort and contribution of the audit committee, of a committee member or a director more broadly, is going to, yeah, I just don't think that's a reliable indicator.
We have a comment in the chat box, and that's from Vinita. Vinita, did you want to just unmute yourself and, tell us all about your comment, or would you like me to just repeat it to everyone in the room?
No, thank you. I was just saying that, no, I don't agree with the statement, including myself. So many of us are directors on NFPs and startups because we just want to see good governance and contribute to organizations with a purpose. And we're not remunerated. So I was just trying to say that I wouldn't agree with that statement. And I think that's what something Kerry's already reflected. Thank you.
No, thank you very much for those observations. Appreciate it. You know, one of the challenges for not-for-profits in particular, not only not-for-profits, but can be attracting high quality. I don't agree with that statement. I've made that plain, but when positions aren't remunerated, attracting, retaining members with the skills and the quality required can be more challenging. But that doesn't mean, of course, that you need to settle for some lower standard, and indeed the duties that we're talking about in terms of good governance apply to all directors and officers, paid or unpaid. But it can be particular. You know, organisations will often tend to have those come to it with great passion and great investment in the purpose of the organisation, and that's absolutely needed, but it may not be enough. And so your processes for understanding and recruiting the skills that you need on your boards, I said at the start, it's really important that it's a contextual approach, but we shouldn't permit a dilution of the skills and experience needed to ensure the good governance of our organisations. So some other things on the radar. The AICD in February published its NFP governance survey that's publicly available, worth a flick through if it hasn't otherwise come your way. A couple of things that it touches on that I will just mention today is that it speaks about the changing nature of governance. And it says, you know, governance is often described as noses in, fingers out. But the survey reflects that more and more directors are getting more actively involved and are more hands-on. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but that can then create some issues of its own in terms of the relationship with management and the executives. So being clear around roles and responsibilities, or the clarity around roles and responsibilities, can potentially become blurred. And if you've worked with a board that's very hands-on, it can sometimes, as much as that might be well intended, it can sometimes get in the way. But certainly the survey participants, respondents to the survey, share the experiences that the nature of governance has changed, and there's been a greater degree of work by the board above and beyond reliance on its constituent committees. And it points, of course, to a whole range of other issues on the not on the horizon, on the in front of our organisations in terms of climate, ESG, workforce challenges, and so on. Now, making sense of those and understanding what they mean for your own organisations is the important thing here. I mean, of course, in ESG, you know, the likelihood of mandatory standards and the reporting around that, I think, isn't too far away. But at this point, it's the important thing is to understand the relevance and significance and the course of action that makes sense for your own organisations, whether for profit or for purpose. Oh, yes, please, if you don't mind.
Yep. So we've got Gregor, who said in the NFP space, the board are usually volunteers. We have a best interest of the organisation and its members. Rochelle has said, yes, I think personal passion / values play a big part, also speaking from personal experience. And then we have Danae Herland, who said, we've had a mixed experience. Certainly the effort and passion is there soon after recruitment.
No, thanks for the comments. I mean, what some organisations will do is recognising that not everyone's going to come to the table as, you know, some kind of governance guru, is provide training and education, information, support for directors who come with passion and commitment to the purpose, but not necessarily the competencies or the awareness of these duties. Ignorant or not, they still apply to all our directors and officers. So the organisation can play a role in helping that uplift. by providing access to education. It doesn't mean channeling everyone off to the AICD course, not that there's any problem with that, but that can be expensive. But there are other ways in which organisations can access the education, the tools and the information they need to try and help equip their directors and maintain that over time. Because as we're seeing here, there is a lot to be across. You can know everything there is to know about your organisation, your sector and what you're doing, but there are a lot of things swirling around that we also need to make sense of. And not everyone's going to come to the table when we're thinking about digital transformation, ESG, climate and so on. We may not all personally have individual depth in that space, but we still have an obligation to be aware of the relevance and meaning for our organisation, which means we need to have access to information and insights so that we've got the information, the availability, the quality and quantity of information that we need in order to meet our governance responsibilities. Was there some new comments there or are they approved? Okay. One of the difficulties can be when, and you may see it from, actually I'll come back to that point when I talk about diversity, because this is also a publicly available report released earlier this year. It's a joint initiative between Governance Institute of Australia, for whom I chair its New South Wales ACT Council, Governance Institute and Watermark released the 2023 Board Diversity Index. Now this is ASX 300, but I think there's still it's a worthwhile reference point for thinking about its implications for your own organisations. When you think about diversity more broadly, we're thinking about diversity in terms of gender, ethnicity, skills, age, independence. There are a lot of different aspects to this. But I think it's fair to say for the ASX 300 at least, while there have been some improvements, there's still plenty of opportunity to uplift and improve the diversity of the boards. And for those of you who have seen diverse boards in action, it's wonderful. When you get diversity of thinking, diversity of critical thinking, when you get different inputs and different perspectives, that makes for a rich mix of discussion and debate and better decision making. That is good governance. A lack of diversity of any kind promotes groupthink, promotes insular thinking. So if you can surround and equip your boards with diverse members who absolutely care about the organisation, what it's doing, but also bring different perspectives to the table, then the benefit you'll gain from that and the opportunity to create and not simply protect value for your organisation will be promoted. When we talk about skills, one of the points here is that there was no change in those to those who had a non-accounting background. Prompted me to say that one of the challenges for any board of any size or sector is that certain directors will have certain skills, and the more common ones are finance, accounting, legal, and so on. And one of the challenges can be that when an issue of that nature comes up, the rest of the directors just look at that person or people. Now, governance is a shared responsibility. Not knowing about something doesn't diminish your duty. That's not to say any of us can be experts in everything, but you need to still be sufficiently informed. You know, one of the cases a number of years ago wasn't Centro, James Hardy case in an action by ASIC against the directors. One of the directors, this is a large ASX listed entity, gave evidence that when certain types of discussions came to the board or items came to the board, they tuned out. So that was their evidence, as if to say, well, it's not my responsibility. Now, in fact, we know that that's not the case. Not knowing about something doesn't excuse your responsibility. it doesn't diminish the governance standard. And so while it's important to have a good mix of skills and competencies around the table, you'll often need to reach out to other people and to other sources of information so that you've got what you need in front of you to make sense of an increasingly diverse and complex landscape. And you know, you sometimes see it in exec teams as well. Anything turns to the CIO. I mean, we can't. Yes, there's a role for expertise, but the point which I've make is that that doesn't with that person. So my final comment is just to point to this event coming up. If you've got any interest in joining it from a not-for-profit perspective, Governance Institute is running an event nationally in person if you're in Brizzy, but otherwise online. In July, you can go online and find some more about that should you wish to participate. But otherwise, that's it from my prepared remarks. If you've got some questions and discussion, we've got time to do so. And I'm particularly keen to, you know, if someone wants to share some stories, you don't have to identify where you're from, but some of the practical challenges or great instances of good governance you've seen, it'd be good to hear from you as well.
Any comments in the room from anyone? Yeah, sure.
You spoke earlier on about the gifts and benefits that people will get. Is there a limit on that? Is there a dollar value limit or for if you're going into a seminar of some sort and you basically get maybe an attendance type gift or you know, something like that? Is there a limit?
There's not a universal one that I'm aware of. It is common for organisations to define what that is. And I've seen some very, very low ones to more generous ones, but it is a matter for the organisation to define. I mentioned the grey. I mean, I did see a situation once where a public sector agency had been invited to a law firm's Christmas party, and they're tying themselves into knots trying to work out what would the average value per head if they had 3 drinks each. And getting so complicated, they didn't even go. And because I didn't want to, anyway, so yeah, they've got to be practical, of course, but knowing where that line is. And of course, if there's ever any doubt, speak up. The sunlight test will cure conflicts.
We got one more question here.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. Sorry, I just want to share with you and some my previous experience and has a related question. So I was working in a risk and compliance role, and the thing is that as a person, if you see as voice, we raise the voice and we say we saw something which is not right. That's as a risk and compliance manager, I would say. But the thing is that culturally, the CEO and the board, they don't take it on chin, basically. So what are the kind of, as an employee nowadays or in the current scenario, we have this kind of any because at that time, you know, I didn't quit the organization, but I was asked to. So is there any framework to protect the employee with human resource or someone else or someone as it is a duty of the board of directors also to ensure that they should be taken care of?
Absolutely, yeah. But that's a great example of where in practice it gets challenging, because it is, as I said at the start, yeah, good governance is around leadership, culture and conduct. And if that's not there, you can't manufacture it through an articulation of a policy. And ultimately, you know, in a serious case, you know, there would be access to whistleblower or speak up type arrangements. You could potentially be reaching out to the chair. But there's serious things to do, right? And it takes courage to do that, particularly if it involves a senior leader such as the CEO. They're not easy conversations to have. But in particularly if it's an issue, but maybe not so serious as to warrant a whistleblower type situation, Yeah, ultimately, I think you would need to, as a professional, need to make a choice as to whether that's a place you want to work. Just a very quick anecdote. I was working as when it was with one of the big 4 firms. We had a client where the CEO, very autocratic CEO, new incoming chair of the Audit and Risk Committee, wanted to do a risk review. CEO rolled his eyes and permitted us to come in and do our thing. Part of that, we had a discussion with the senior executive team about, well, what are your key risks? So we then came to a workshop in Melbourne where I played back what we'd heard from the consultation with the management team. The CEO pushed himself back to "That's BS" to me. To which I said, this isn't our firm's opinion. This is the voice of your executive. But the culture was one in which they were too scared to speak up. The CEO ruled by fear, and sadly, ultimately, the poor old chief risk officer got shot about 3 days before Christmas. That's an environment you don't want to be part of. And so when we talk about good governance, you can't force it. It's going to thrive organically through the sponsorship of people doing the right thing. But ultimately, if it doesn't, if the environment's not going to promote that, you can't do it on your own.
We have one more question in the room, so we'll take one more question in the room, and then I can see there are more questions online. We'll go to the online attendees and then come back to the room if there's more questions.
Hi, Kerry. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Ada Sakari at School of Business. I'm a specialist in governance in the not-for-profit sector. I did research on the professional identity of directors and the governance of Islamic schools in New South Wales. Not so much a question, I think, more of a discussion point. Kerry, that was a great presentation. Thank you so much. When talking about good governance, I think I really liked your discussion about changing language in terms of the way we define good governance or what we look at when we are trying to determine what good governance means, and potentially, particularly looking at behaviour in terms of directors. My theoretical contribution is focused on that it's people who make boards, not boards that make people. And it's not boards that make organisations or protect organisations, it's people. And so it's really important for us to consider the person, the human behaviour element when we're looking at boards. And so our purpose, particularly in the not-for-profit sector, our actions and our behaviours really determine the type of decision-making that's occurring in the boardroom. And perhaps that's discussions for us to have later in the future.
Well, thanks for that observation. It's curious, isn't it, that somehow, for some reason, that people and humans gets lost sometimes in these things, and they become kind of debates about other things in terms of frameworks and assurance and other mechanical aspects of this, which, as I said, it have a role, but clearly it's not the determinant of good governance, as you've said. Thank you.
I'll just stop the screen share. Someone asked so we can better see everyone.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
So anyone online, did you want to ask your question yourself, or do you want me to read your question for you? Yep, Vinita.
I just wanted to share some experiences with some of the boards I've been, and before I do that, Kerry, that was really very great presentation, very reflective. So thank you for that. You know, as directors, we are coached, trained to always have our minds focused on risk. And I had an executive career with New South Wales Treasury before I jumped into the private sector space. So I'm constantly encouraging my board colleagues to focus on risk. And the interesting thing is, quite often people still think of risk as that stemming from financial risk and are quite dismissive that, oh, you know, the FRAC can look at it or ARC can look at it, the Audit Risk Committee. And for the better part of last, 5 years, I keep drumming that risk is what everyone has to think about, everyone on the board. So just any reflections there, how we've shifted the nature and discussion around risk from being very finance and accounting focused to risk more broadly?
Thanks, Nita. Great observation. Out of the Hayne Royal Commission, this concept of non-financial risk gained a lot of currency. I'm not personally sure it's all that helpful because arguably, all risks have a financial implication. But I think it's elevating, I think two things. I think it's perhaps three. I think firstly, it's aligning the risk discussion with the purpose and the objectives of the organisation. Risk to what? Because otherwise, if it's just a list of risks and worries and horrible things that could go wrong, then I'm not sure we're having a conversation about risk in the right context. But you've got to have the culture to have that conversation because it's kind of safe to have the conversation around safety and fraud and financial risks, but it's harder and requires more courage and permission to have a conversation about strategic type risks. Risk professionals will often say, I wish we had a seat at the table. To which I also say, well, what are you bringing to the table? And you've got to be able to bring to the table critical thinking and insights and experiences to contribute to those discussions. So I think it's both sides. I think there does need to be mandate and an environment in which critical thinking there's a thirst for that. But then as advisors and practitioners, we need to be able to make a positive practical contribution to those discussions.
We have one more question from Sylvia, and she would like me to read her question. She said, I'm in a startup not-for-profit group. How can I address the serious response to those who put hands up with a good heart, but with little understanding?
Very difficult, very difficult. I wish there were an easy answer, but there isn't. That is really challenging because you're not just resource constrained, but as I've said, you still got to have the environment. But it is challenging. I've worked with some member-based organisations where there have been limitations around the quality and competency of people, hearts in the right place, but just don't have the skills to be doing the job. So it is tough. But I think the extent to which you can help hold up the mirror to permit reflection and also bring awareness of what the expectations are can help. I'm not suggesting that it's a quick fix or a magic solution, but that can help.
Any more questions in the room? I actually might have a question for you, Kerry. Do you know how at the start of a presentation you mentioned about the quantity versus the quality of information? I know it might sound a bit like a double-edged sword, but how would an organization know when too much is too much and quality is good enough for decision making?
I think it's partly as executives or management thinking about, to whom am I providing this and for what purpose? Why do they need it? And so before it even gets to the board, we should be thinking about, well, what's the nature and quantity of information needed, but importantly, the quality, thinking about our audience and why it's being provided. Is it for information, for awareness, for decision? And so the extent of the information, I think, is informed by that. Certainly, if directors are saying, I don't understand, there's too much, I don't understand, what do I need to know? Can you distill this for me? If you're hearing that, of course, that would be a prompt for a review. Some organisations put a hard limit. No board paper can be more than X pages. That provides a discipline, but it's a fairly blunt object as well. But that's certainly one way to draw a line under the volume of information. Not saying it's the best way, but it's certainly one method to promote clarity and conciseness in board information.
Thank you. Any more questions or anything? Comments from anyone? Nisha? Yeah.
So this isn't a question, it's just a comment. I really liked the idea how you put up on one of your first slides, cosmetic governance versus good governance. So I think that would apply to a lot of organisations where we do tend to do a tick the box exercise.
No, absolutely. Certainly trying to capture the spirit as much as the letter of those things is really important.
If we don't have any more questions, I think there might be one online. No. Oh, yeah. Yeah, someone just said perhaps we should attend the governance forum in July. Okay, so if we don't have any more questions, being mindful that most people would be on their lunch break,
Yes.
we would like to say thank you to Kerry for this amazing.
No, thank you. Thanks very much for the invitation. I've enjoyed the opportunity to talk with you. Thank you very much. It's very kind.
Hogan from CPA.
Thank you very much.
It was really a very informative presentation, very thought-provoking, and I'm sure many people would have enjoyed that. So thank you very much, Kerry, for your
Welcome.
time and effort.
Thanks very much, everyone. Thanks for being part of the discussion. Appreciate it. Thank you.
So our next discussion group would be on the 7th of November. And as most of you would remember, you had asked for Vicky Norton to be back and present on PAFs. So she would be there in November. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much.